The boundaries of blessing. Leaders appointed to divvy up the land, cities for the Levites to live in, cities of refuge, the laws of inheritance for female heirs, women caring for those in ministry, a young girl and an older woman healed miraculously, graciously by Jesus. All this and more today on 3 in 1, as we consider Numbers chapters 34 through 36 and Luke chapter 8. Well, we finish another book of the Bible today, the book of Numbers. That's so cool. So far, we've journeyed through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Not to mention Matthew, Mark, and part of Luke. What a journey! What an adventure, all to know and enjoy Him forever. Have you found your relationship with Him deepening through our time together in the Word? Don't worry if you're not able to make that assessment yet. Like the seed and the soils in our New Testament reading today, there is often a lag time between sowing seed, fruition, and the harvest. So continue to trust God and continue to allow Him to sow good seed. See, His Word is the good seed, and eventually, after it's been planted in the soil of your soul, it will burst forth with life and with fruit. Sometimes it just takes time, like the time it would take the nation of Israel to fight by faith to take their inheritance. In God's mind, it was already a done deal. He had them map it all out ahead of time in chapter 34, even while their enemies were still living in the land. Not only the borders of the land of blessing, but also the individual inheritance for each family. I wonder what the New Testament equivalent would be, for we know that the land of promise in the New Testament is not heaven, for there are wars in the land of promise. We have to fight by faith in the land of promise, fighting by faith to receive what has already been given to us. So maybe it would look like this. Finding some promise of God, something that He's said, something that He's already given to us, but we have yet to see it manifest in our life. And maybe like Israel with their promise, we simply have to put our foot down. Remember the promise? Wherever you put your foot down, that's yours. Putting our foot down the promises of God and taking it by faith. Now, obviously, you can take this too far, and it can turn into willy-nilly nonsense. Like, I believe that God can do exceedingly abundantly more than I can ask or think, so I think He wants to give me a Ferrari. Yeah, that's it, a Ferrari. I claim a Ferrari by faith. No, that's witchcraft. That's silliness. Let's dial it back a bit so it can stay biblical. Take, for instance, the promised land of Romans 8:1. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That promised land is yours in Jesus. But it is a fight sometimes, isn't it? A real fight of faith. For I feel condemnation from time to time. And sometimes it's difficult to discern whether that condemnation comes from God or from the devil or from my overactive conscience. So in the midst of that battle, I find myself claiming this part of my inheritance within the boundaries of God's blessing. This promised land has already been given to me, and I simply have to take it by faith. And sometimes that's a fight of faith. And many of us have battle scars from fights like these. Almost every single Sunday, I get hit hard right before I have to preach in that pulpit. And I find myself fighting by faith to take what has already been given to me, putting my foot down and proclaiming the promises of God, promises like Romans 8:1. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. And promises like 2 Corinthians 5:21. God made Him who had no sin to be sin for us so that we might become the very righteousness of God in Him. And promises like Nehemiah 8:10. Do not sorrow, for the joy of the Lord is your strength. Promises like Psalm 103:12. As far as the east is from the west, so far as He removed our transgressions from us. And how can I forget promises like Hebrews 9:14? Oh man, one Sunday morning, you may even remember this. The fight was so fierce, the attack was so intense, I found myself literally stomping my feet as I walked around the block outside of the church proclaiming this promise from Hebrews 9:14. How much more then will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered Himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? So search out the boundaries of your blessing by reading the Word. see and take note of what has already been given to you by God, and fight to take what has already been given to you by God. Fight, put your foot down, take your stand, and then you'll find that even that battle belongs to the Lord. Okay, on to Numbers chapter 35. Cities for the Levites and cities of refuge. 48 cities were given to the Levites to live in. No land was given to them as an inheritance, only cities to live in, for the Lord and their ministry to the Lord was their inheritance. But consider the wisdom of our God in evenly distributing his representatives throughout the land of promise, so that his people would always be in proximity to a pastor, salted throughout the land in these cities. It's so cool. Then there were these cities of refuge. What were they? What were these cities of refuge? Not as many as the cities for the Levites, only 6. And there was something about the difference between murder and manslaughter, something about the difference between intentional killing and accidental death, and something about this avenger of blood coming to kill you. See, it would be the responsibility of the nearest relative to avenge the death. And often they did not know whether the death was intentional or accidental, or they just didn't care, and they were coming to make things right by ending your life. So God designated these 6 cities for you to flee to until all of this could be sorted out. Cities of refuge, cities where you would be safe until it was determined whether the death was intentional or not. Now, just because someone ruled that it was unintentional, that didn't always stop the avenger. So in the city of refuge, you could stay safe as long as the current high priest was alive. If you ventured outside of the city, it was game on. If the high priest died, it was game on, and the avenger could still come to kill you. Now consider this. Jesus Christ is our city of refuge for our unintentional sins and for our intentional sins. And in him, we are safe from the avenger eternally. Why? For he, our high priest, will never die. Isn't that awesome? See, he is one who became a priest not on the basis of a regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. Hebrews 7:16 says that to us, proclaims that to us, that Jesus is our eternal, indestructible city of refuge, where we sinners are eternally secure as we run to him for refuge. Oh, the depths of the riches of God's mercy and God's grace. Okay, on to our last chapter in the book of Numbers, chapter 36, where we see a problem solved for women who would be heirs of their fathers. See, usually an inheritance would be given to the firstborn son. But what if there was no son? What if there were only daughters? Well, we actually encountered that in the Word already in Numbers chapter 27, so this here is a different but related matter. Here, the question that God cares about is, what if a woman who was the heir marries into another tribe with another inheritance? Would her inheritance get lost? Would it be given away? Or would it be confused? These practical questions with practical solutions and a practical application. It is good and godly to plan ahead. What would happen if you die? Where would your inheritance go? Are you sure? Is it all in place properly? This is part of our responsibility as parents, to have all of this in place. It's part of our stewardship. Even ancient Israel had to think these things through. Okay, on to our New Testament reading for today, Luke chapter 8. What can we learn in Luke chapter 8? Well, right off the bat here, we see how Jesus was supported in ministry. No high-pressure tactics, no emotional pleas, just the free will offerings of those listed here in this chapter, and many others who were simply grateful for the ministry of Jesus, and they wanted to provide for Jesus so that many others would benefit from his ministry as well. So they supported Jesus. They provided for him, as it says, from their substance. Now, did you notice something about those who supported Jesus from their substance? They were all women, at least those who are listed here. women from all walks of life, grateful for the ministry of Jesus. Women from the city, like Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward, and women from the villages, like Mary, called Magdalene, who had 7 demons come out of her at the command of Jesus. Can you imagine how miserable her life may have been before Jesus had come into her life and set her free? She was so grateful for grace that out of the overflow of that gratefulness, she and many others gladly gave so that others could be set free by this same Jesus of Nazareth. Now, it must be noted that these women were obviously a vital part of the ministry of Jesus, a Jewish rabbi. And that just didn't happen in Jesus' day. But Jesus wasn't just any old Jewish rabbi. He was and is the express image of God the Father. He is the message of God the Father, the message that God the Father wanted to give the men and the women that he so loved. And at the end of the chapter, we see a few more women that Jesus loved and ministered to, like his mom and a 12-year-old girl, sick and suffering, and an older woman who was sick and suffering as well. 2 women, both sick, both suffering, both loved by Jesus, and both called daughters. Did you notice that? There are few words in our language so dear. Daughter. Jesus loved these 2 daughters so much, even in the midst of their suffering, even in the midst of their desperation. Well, the desperation of the first daughter's dad. As Jairus, a synagogue ruler, risked his reputation, risked everything to come and call on Jesus to help his daughter. His desperation overruled his hesitation, and he risked it all, falling at the feet of Jesus and begging him to come and help. But he wasn't the only one that needed help that day. There was another in that crushing crowd that day, risking it all to just touch the edge of Jesus' garment, believing that if she could just get that close, her suffering would end as well. But her issue was an issue of blood, making her unclean, making everyone else that touched her in that crushing crowd unclean as well. But her desperation overruled her hesitation, and she found herself pushing and pressing through that crowd as well, thinking, 12 years I've been unclean, 12 years I've been isolated, 12 years I've been suffering. How old was the girl? Don't forget about that girl. Her dad didn't. So can you imagine how high his desperation and frustration was when Jesus stopped and asked, "Who touched me?" See, the woman had made it to Jesus. She touched the edge of his garment, and she was healed. And now she wanted to sneak away before anyone who knew her saw her. But Jesus wanted her cleansing to be public. Jesus wanted her confession to be public, so that everyone would now know that this woman who had been unclean for so long was now completely clean. So he says, "Who touched me?" He knows who touched him. He just wanted her to confess. He wanted her to be publicly clean, in a public confession, you see? But who touched me? My daughter is dying. Hundreds of people are pressing all around you, and yet you stop and say, "Who touched me?" And then at that moment, again, it would seem that Jesus added the ultimate insult to the father's injury by saying to this woman, whom he, Jairus, as the synagogue ruler, probably personally had to declare time and time again, unclean, unfit for worship, "Daughter, be of good cheer. Your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Can you imagine what it would have been like for that dad to hear Jesus say to this woman, "Daughter," while his daughter is dying, especially with what happens next? While he was still speaking, someone came from the ruler of the synagogue's house saying to him, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher." The worst words. Words we wouldn't wish on anyone. Your daughter is dead. But when Jesus heard it, he answered him, saying, "Do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be made well." And when he came into the house, he permitted no one to go in except Peter, James, and John, and the father and the mother of the girl. Now all wept and mourned for her, but he said, "Do not weep. She is not dead, but sleeping." and they ridiculed him, knowing that she was dead. But he put them all outside, took her by the hand, saying, "Little girl, arise." Then her spirit returned, and she arose immediately. Oh man, what a roller coaster today. As we saw everything from land and Levites and avengers of blood and cities of refuge, and the fact that God cares for even practical matters like inheritances and daughters receiving their inheritances, and the fact that Jesus cares about daughters, young and old, being healed and whole. How about you? Are you a daughter? Are you a son? He cares about you just as much. And he came so that you could have an eternal refuge as an adopted daughter, as an adopted son, with full rights and privileges in his Father's family forever.